Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We have today's speakers and guests from all over the world. So thank you very much for joining us today. We are very excited to see you all. Today we will be talking about public-private partnership and why governments and private entities are increasingly looking at such procurement arrangements for social and economic infrastructure development. So today we have a highly experienced panel of speakers with more than 150 years of experience, PPP experience in total, and I am very excited to introduce them to you. So before I start the introductions, I just wanted to say that we will have dedicated 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So you can ask your questions at the end, or if you have any specific question related to the discussion that is going on, please send them through. We will be checking Q&A box in the Q&A box, and we will try to address them as much as we can throughout the discussion. Okay, so I will not hold any longer. So I'd like to start with the speaker's introduction today, and our first speaker is Catherine Workman, is a partner and head of the Middle East region for law firm Pinsent. Catherine is an expert in PPP projects, having worked in this field since 1995. She has advised all stakeholders on projects, including governments, sponsors, lenders, and on a variety of projects across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Catherine, thank you very much for joining us today.
Sorry. Thank you.
Second speaker, Yvon Mompeyssin. Yvon is head of strategic development for ENGIE Solutions, covering the Middle East. Yvon has nearly 20 years of experience in development, funding and operations of energy efficient street lighting and buildings, renewable power supply, green transportation, and smart utilities for public authorities and businesses. Yvon, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Are we going into our third speaker, and he's based in the UK, so it's a very early morning. Jonathan, thank you very much for dedicating your early morning and spending with us. So Jonathan Stewart, head of public sector for project management and consultancy firm GLEAD. Jonathan has been central to the development of GLEAD's public sector business over the past 25 years, and he has overseen the delivery of over 400 PPP schemes and multiple traditional projects. He has advised local authorities and central government departments on strategy, procurement, commercial, and efficiency opportunities. So Jonathan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you too.
We have also today speakers from Australia. So actually Jim and Cayman both are sparing the evening today with us. So I will start with Jim. Jim Lambrianidis is a project director for Plenary Group in Australia, a private sector business specializing in the design, construction, and FM services delivery aspects of PPP projects. Jim also has over 25 years of experience with both government, including UAE government, in the development of tender documentation for PPP projects, as well as extensive private sector expertise in the successful bidding and development of PPP projects. Jim, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And the fifth speaker, Cayman McCabe, Cayman is a partner within Condal, based in our Melbourne office in Australia. Over his 30 years of consulting engineering experience, Cayman has gained extensive PPP experience both as a technical advisor as well as part of bid consortia. He covers the delivery of hospitals, schools, correctional centers, and plans. So Cayman, thank you very much. Great to have you,
Thank you.
On the panel too. And the moderator of today's panel, and also a person who will be asking your questions or addressing questions as well, is Richard Stratton, part managing director, MENA at Candle. 27 years at Candle, Richard has gained PPP and PFI experience, primarily in the healthcare sector, having been involved since the initial introduction of PFI procurement model in the UK during 90s. He has advised both the public and private sectors, so he has a very good perspective on risk, opportunities, and value generated through PPP procurement. So Richard, panel, it's over to you.
Oh, good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining, wherever you are in the world, and for giving up your time. Delighted to have all of our very knowledgeable panelists here for the discussion today. Just to say that this is the first webinar in a series of 4, and it's more to discuss PPP at a higher level and explain and discuss some of the attributes of it, the applications of it, the benefits of it, and so on. And then in the subsequent 3 webinars that we'll be running at future dates, we'll look at getting into some more of the detail. So getting straight into it, for those, starting with the questions, I should say, so for those less familiar with the PPP procurement process, I wanted to get our panelists to explain how it differs from a traditional procurement process. And I thought, Catherine, perhaps we would start with you, and maybe Jim could jump in and give some thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I suppose for me, it's about a difference in approach. So some of the unique aspects of that PPP aspect, and then I'll do a little bit of a compare. So is one about transfer of risk. So as a lawyer, I might say that. So kind of often is stated to be that the risks are transferred to the party best able to manage the risk. Because actually that's on the basis that not all risks naturally sit with one party or the other, but if you then pass it to the one who's best able to manage. I think what I've seen during the 25 years that I've been doing it is if you pass risks that are not naturally taken, for example, by the private sector, that can be unnecessarily costly. Equally, you can then allow, if you transfer the risk, for somebody to say, well, look, if I take the risk, I should keep the reward. Another aspect is the output nature of a contract. So at the heart of a PPP contract is something that's output in nature. If you pass the risk of design, building, and/or operation to the private sector, then you need to allow them to deliver that risk. So therefore, the contract will be lighter on that construction services specification than a more prescriptive traditional procurement. So for example, in some of the projects I've done from an energy from waste project, the output specification might say, design, build and operate a facility that can process 250,000 tonnes of municipal solid waste a year. And then the private sector can decide, is that done by a mass burn moving grey incinerator, a fluidized bed, or a materials recovery facility. So they've got the ability to do something, whereas a traditional procurement would massively prescribe that. I think the other aspect and the main feature is financing. Under a PPP project, you will use private financing and the private sector will borrow the money for the project, whereas under a traditional procurement, it will be financed by government gilts. I mean, this does mean that PPP does have more expensive financing, but that's kind of slightly balanced out with the delivery of the asset and how that's done. And that was a key aspect, the development of PPP to potentially be off the balance sheet of the relevant country. I know that that was a consideration for the UK government and that it wasn't under UK PLC. But as I say, the private public sector will fund it otherwise. And I think the only other one, sorry, I've probably gone on a bit, is about structuring. So with this financing, it means that the public sector, largely the way you structure the process is the public sector doesn't pay for the services until the construction is complete. And therefore the assets are more likely to be delivered to budget on time, which is not always the case with traditional procurement. So I know you asked Jim to maybe jump in, and I hope I haven't stolen all of your thunder, Jim. And you're definitely a man who'll deliver on time and budget, I'm sure.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I think a lot of that what you've said is correct. From a build perspective, the private sector take risk on time and cost. But also particularly fitness for purpose. From a point of view of a builder, as well as from the private entity, we take fitness for purpose risk that what we build and what we deliver meets the requirements of the output spec. And through the life of that project, if government or the operator feels that it doesn't meet the requirements of the output spec, we're at risk to actually rectify any of those issues. The other issue, I think, is the soft and hard FM services, which differs because it's all wrapped up in the single package. Where the quality of services are defined, we have to provide a level of service that meets the output specification. And if we don't do that, there's an abatement regime in place to actually penalise us for not meeting those quality standards. And I think finally, wrapped up in the whole PPP is the maintenance and life cycle replacement. So the public sector get an asset that's well looked after throughout the life of the project, less so than in a traditional build where it's just built and it's basically based on funding and allocation of funding, whether or not they can actually upkeep those facilities to a particular standard. Whereas in the PPP, those standards have to be met. Otherwise, there's penalties for not actually meeting those standards in terms of delivery of the infrastructure, but also in terms of the soft service delivery aspects.
Okay, so interesting points there. I just wanted to pick up on one thing, and maybe for the benefit of some of our viewers today. Catherine, you mentioned the term sort of more expensive money, that there are, which implies there could be more cost-effective ways to procure PPP. But is it not the case that when you're procuring through a PPP, the more expensive money is largely associated with paying interest charges on funding and operational costs that typically would be funded elsewhere if you were procuring a project traditionally?
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely, that is right. I think the balance I was mentioning between that slightly more costly money, because government gilts and government borrowing is without a doubt much cheaper than the private sector. But even actually, and most projects do this, when they run the public sector comparator, once everything is all thrown in, it's still a more cost-effective approach than a traditional procurement. So I think, notwithstanding that, and that's the counterbalance to a lot of people who are critical often of PPP. And I know we had our own back in the UK, Mayor Ken Livingstone, it was one of his greatest statements, was this is, expensive money. And if you only looked at that one aspect, then that would be the case. But actually, once you look at the whole balance, the balance of risk, the transfer of risk, all the things that Jim was saying, the benefits that you get, once you put all of that in together, it becomes a much more cost-effective, better approach to delivering infrastructure.
Yeah, I think one other thing, Catherine, is the fact that not all the funding is debt. we have potentially around about 10% of equity, and that equity is totally at risk, whereas the debt is potentially ring fenced. But the equity, and there will be many projects where they've gone a bit awry and equity's lost all their money. So to some extent, the government still gets an asset, but financially it's fairly cheaper way of doing it. Whereas if it fails on its side, it just keeps printing money and actually pouring money into a hole without any any benefit.
Right. Well, I think that probably leads us on a little bit to the next question, which was, I think, associated with some studies in other regions like Australia, probably the UK as well, suggests that PPP procured developments do offer superior cost efficiency over traditional. I thought, Cayman, maybe you might like to talk a little bit about this, perhaps for some of the operational issues and maybe energy, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, particularly from a design perspective, I think it's the whole idea that there's an ability to integrate innovation. There's a time-bound delivery, so you have a time you have to meet, and you are also considering the operational, so the hard and soft FM, and also the maintenance costs that goes along for that time frame. They all generally lead to a best or more cost-efficient or beneficial outcome than a traditional procurement. There are some studies in Australia that have suggested that you get about 11% benefit when you consider it from a contractual commitment perspective, and about a 30% cost efficiency when you judge it from the inception of it to the traditional procurement. So it's quite significant in terms of its benefit, and it actually can and has delivered some more innovative solutions than a traditional procurement may not have actually done so.
What do you think drives that? I mean, if I just say from my own experience of doing PPP or PFI, as it was called in healthcare, a lot of the traditional projects I was involved in healthcare before the PFI or the Private Finance Initiative was rolled out were rarely evaluated over the whole life of the development. And then when PFI came in, we started looking at projects for the whole life of the contract, which could be 25, 30 years.
So from my perspective, I think it's the advancements in technology and the actual, I suppose, the ability to use evidence-based solutions that have tested things. And they can be quite simple things. When Jim, as he knows, when he delivered the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, the idea of destination control for lifts was seen as this odd and weird thing that shouldn't be done because of the rules and regulations at the time. Now it's seen as virtually a prescribed solution. So it's allowing things, technologies and approaches to be adopted that change the way things are future procured in the more traditional manner. A lot of those government entities have their rule book that you have to deliver, but that actually limits and constrains things, whereas a PPP offers that ability to be those things to be tested or challenged.
Yeah, and I think also, Cayman, there seems to be a different approach to PPPs compared to traditional delivery, where you find that PPPs have a fairly larger risk profile where the private sector can actually take a view on that risk and how they manage that risk, and then you look at some of the typical public sector delivery, and the private sector that delivers it in a traditional approach has a completely different view as to how much they can actually extract from government in those traditional projects. Now we 12 months ago, we bid on a roads project. It was a list of 14 different projects, which the government, we went through a number of processes and BAFO, and then the government suspended the project and went to market which was in the paper a couple of weeks ago. Went to market individually on those projects, and on two projects, the uplifting cost of what the PPP was compared to those two projects was a 40% increase in price. which is significant in terms of the way that the PPP procures it, and the efficiency in understanding, as you said, the technology aspects, the design aspects, and how best it can actually achieve the outcome.
So with that, it's sort of interesting overview, I guess, Catherine, Jim and Cayman, thanks for that. Yvon, I was wondering if you wanted to share what you believe the top 3 key attributes to a successful PPP procured development might look like.
Yes, thank you. Well, in our experience in various types of PPPs, like Olga mentioned, we've been working on energy, utilities, smart cities, but also on more traditional social infrastructure. Some of the common attributes need to be highlighted. For us, the first one is that the public authority that delegates the public service through PPP needs to really be clear on what they want to achieve with this PPP. And it's not that simple, but it needs to be well thought through, sorry. And for us, it has been the source of complications down the line. So are they looking for innovation or cost reduction or optimizing the use of capital or diversification of economy and stuff? It's very, very important that objectives are clear and are aligned between the parties through the documentation of the project. So for us, key attributes is a very clear objective roadmap and from which we derive the entire project. The second is the sustainability of the project and of the way and the way it's done. And sustainability is in 2 ways: economic sustainability. So it has to work for all the parties over the life of the project and beyond. We're talking about minimum 15 years, and often it goes way beyond. We've done a PPP in the US for 50 years, 50, and we've done 2 actually. And yeah, it's not an easy task to make sure that 50 years from now we'll still be very good friends, but we still need to work on this. And obviously, the second sustainability angle is the eco-friendly sustainability, I would say, and that is very close to our heart at ENGIE, to make sure that the CO2 impact, the community impact, or any other potential harm to the environment or to society is properly identified, analyzed, and mitigated. Another the key attribute I would say is regulation. So all of this can't be improvised, and so we think that clear regulation needs to be put in place so that everyone knows the rules of the game and can plan implementation accordingly. It improves on delivery, it improves on financing, it improves on every aspect on the project if regulation is well thought through and clear.
Okay, Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Richard, thank you for that, and Yvonne, thank you for that. Well, first of all, I think actually dedication, commitment from all parties, coffee, and champagne at close are always a good idea, because it takes time and effort to set out a 25 to 50 year contract for the private sector to deliver. So just as an aside, that was really as an aside, but we've heard about risk transfer. I'm using the words appropriate risk transfer. Those are the risks that the private sector must be able to control, the risks that are being transferred to them. There's a situation in the early days on projects in the UK, and it's a lesson that I think everybody's learned, is that the public sector tried to ask for payment for the cells being occupied. So the prison cells were being built and be operated and maintained, but the private sector were only going to get paid when those cells were occupied by prisoners. And the private sector said, well, actually, we're not in control of whether you put a prisoner in that cell we've made available for you. We've paid for it, we've built it, we're operating it, got all our staff there, but we're not in control of if a prisoner goes in there. That's your job, public sector, Ministry of Justice. So they actually had to change that, quite rightly really, to they make the prison cells available for occupation, and they get paid for availability. So that's what I mean by appropriate risk transfer. And there's been a number of those sort of issues have gone on over the years, so we get them right. Changing laws, another. Another point is a well-written and clear brief that comes out, I think is pretty clear. Well, it's pretty important. The design brief, the output specifications, are they clear? The FM specs and the service requirements, are they clear? The required accommodation standards, if you have those, are they clear? For ongoing life cycle maintenance and retaining the quality of the asset over the period. And then finally, payment mechanisms. We haven't used that word yet. I think it's probably a little bit too much detail, but it's where the deal comes together in how does the public sector pay the private sector. It's where all the risks flow into this payment mechanism that defines how the private sector is paid and on what basis it is paid over 25 years. And the equity and the debt and all the costs of build get paid back. And the term availability payments is one that we can touch on later, but we won't go into now, Richard.
There's much detail involved in that one.
Richard, I'd probably add there that one of the other things I think is really important is a strong technical advisor panel, one that actually understands what the objective is and can actually properly decide whether or not there's how to call it, the solution being put forward actually meets the objective, or potentially even better meets the objective than the brief might have originally called for, because that actually allows things to actually happen more effectively.
Yeah, it's something we also very much appreciate as a developer when we see that the authority is well advised, properly advised. That's critical.
So, I mean, just moving on again with you, Jonathan, then based on what Yvon and yourself have just discussed, what do you believe the key advantages of PPP are to the public sector?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. There are many advantages, actually. I spent a year in the early days with HM Treasury working through what those advantages are for the public sector and working with the department to understand it and to bring projects forward in the early to mid 90s. One thing I think is it's not about capital cost. It's about the whole combination of design, build, finance and operate. And we've talked about whole life costing. The onus is on the private sector to consider not just that 3-year build period, but also the 25 years that follow it in terms of the asset. So you can't just build it and walk away, which is what many developers do in the development market. They build your house and they walk away, and you're left to maintain and look after the issues that are left behind. Here, we have to stand behind it. The private sector has to stand behind the asset it's created and deliver a quality asset and the performance of that asset, that building, for 25 years. We have to think early on about ease of use and the maintenance of facilities. Operationally efficient buildings is one term that I use. That needs to be retained to good standards. And from the public sector point of view, often budget cuts come in over 25, 30 years, and we all know about those. And one of the things that often disappears is maintenance budgets. And then you find your asset goes down in quality fairly quickly. That can't happen here. They signed a contract where they are paying the private sectors to continue to retain the asset to agreed standards. So that actually puts a pressure on the private sector, the public sector to an extent, but actually it delivers better whole life cost. The other one I'll touch on is innovation. How I believe PPPs, and I think Jim touched on it earlier, they encourage and enable innovation in private sector with the output-based specifications. these output specifications is similar to defining a performance requirement, but not the specific solution. They're giving that room for innovation and a broad set of solutions coming forward that encourages good competition in the private sector. And that in turn drives the value that Jim was talking about. One final example, Richard, back to prisons. I like prisons because they come up with some good examples. They set the first prisons in the UK in the mid-90s came up with a completely different solution to the current way prisons were run in the UK. More automated processes, better design solutions that reduced the staffing requirements and actually reduced the net present value by 30%, just by giving that flexibility for innovation. And they were very good value for money projects. So I think that ability for innovation as well.
Okay. And Jim, what are your thoughts in the opposite direction? You know, what do you believe the advantages of PPP are for the private sector?
Well, I think in terms of the private, in terms of PPPs, it's a well and tried and tested procurement process. Again, in terms of there are, you know, as the process has developed over the years, there's a standard risk allocation and the documentation in place is really standard. So most of the major players are familiar with the standardized documentation that's in place. They know in terms of the budgetary allocations, they're fairly much locked away by government, and it provides the capability to innovate and come up with solutions that the government really doesn't really have a handle on in terms of how those approaches are undertaken. Again, there's a steady pipeline of projects which gives the private sector the capability of building teams and providing outcomes that best suit projects. And I think finally, it provides a consortium that's fairly much in place, the skills and a workforce and training and opportunities to actually meet the requirements of each of the particular projects, whether it's a prison, whether it's a hospital. It brings that expertise fairly much to the fore for each of the projects and a greater number of consortia that are capable of actually delivering the process.
That's very interesting. I don't know, Catherine, if you had any thoughts on both of those from your perspective, having to draw up the contracts that tie all parties together.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a lot of this is a balance. It is a balance between the public sector and the private sector. And something I was going to say a bit later on is the commonality of interest of all parties of getting to having an asset delivered and through a balanced risk allocation. I mean, and I've seen many instances where public sector have launched a project and they've said, and here's a contract and it's non-negotiable with the most rubbish set of risk allocation, thinking this is terribly clever, but in fact, actually it is the worst thing that they could have done in combination because, well, for a number of reasons, but it doesn't allow, it will inevitably cause delays later, without a doubt, because if it's a bad risk allocation, but you say it's a take it or leave it, either you'll end up with a number of people who'll take a chance at still bidding and then refuse a bit later. And then it all unravels and you waste time, and then there's procurement challenges. And so there's a huge element of being a balance, but it is a balance that can be achieved that suits everybody, that one party isn't taking more risk than they can bear, and can deliver very clearly, can deliver outstanding projects that mean things are delivered. So yeah, there are loads of pros and cons, but I completely agree with everything Jonathan and Jim has said.
Right, okay. It's interesting. I mean, just, you know, one of the things I was thinking, framing this really as a, you know, we're on this panel and we are probably focusing more on the MENA region and PPP in this region. Of course, there's been lots of PPP delivered globally. We've talked about the UK, we've talked about Australia, and all of us have had experience in lots of different locations. So, Yvon, I was going to just direct this back to you again. With that in mind, and with all the sort of lessons we've learned, and the various other parties involved in PPP, what do you think the key opportunities are for PPP? And probably more with a regional focus, what would you think the key opportunities are? And risks as well, I guess.
Let's start with the risk, because I think it's a good transition with what was just said in terms of risk allocation. So poor risk allocation is a key risk to the project for all parties down the line. That's okay. So, and that's in contracts, but also, like I said, if the strategy, if the alignment of interest isn't well thought through earlier, that's also a major risk. So strong preparation and strong advisors panels is very important. One of the risks also is in the procurement. We've seen a few times selection of the private entity based on the wrong criteria, I should say. I think the selection of the partner is paramount, and that's also a risk down the line for all stakeholders involved. So going for the cheapest, even if the technology or the technical part of the proposal is compliant, sometimes it's risky to take a newcomer or a consortium that hasn't got the right chemistry. So it's important to go in depth for an authority to go in depth into understanding what the consortium is formed of, what are the dynamics, what are the key, the complementarities between the members and the risks in terms of financing, delivery, long-term ability to deliver. Of course, there are opportunities, particularly in the region. I think that one of the main opportunities is social, and by that I mean job creation. It's bringing the private sector will allow upgrading of the jobs. It will allow to bring more engineering jobs or more financial analysis and financial engineering jobs. It allows economic diversification. It allows innovation. Like we said, output-based contracts pushes the private partner to think more about how to deliver and to create more value for both parties, and that's what brings innovation. It diversifies source of funding. It creates opportunities for beyond the pure public sector employees. And close, like I said earlier, close to our heart, it's also an opportunity to improve ecological sustainability. That's a tremendous opportunity when hard key performance indicators are put on the private party on energy efficiency, water efficiency, cooling, decarbonization. We come up with the solutions, and usually they're tried and tested, and they're sustainable.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm going to go off on a tangent a little bit here, because you've highlighted something that I know is very dear to Cayman's heart, but given the climate crisis that our poor planet is in at the moment, to what extent is that being addressed in PPP schemes that are coming out in terms of requirements, in terms of commitments that came in. I don't know if you want to just touch on that one, and maybe Yvon, you could jump back in again and give us your thoughts.
From my perspective, you will rarely see a PPP brief that doesn't actually challenge the design team, what I would say much harder than a traditional procurement team. They'll put all the requirements into the brief that they probably wouldn't necessarily impose on themselves from a traditional procurement perspective. So you'll get minimum requirements for peak load reduction. You'll get minimum requirements on your greenhouse intensity that you must achieve. You've even had the situation where a recent project which came to financial close last week, there was actually calling for achieving I suppose performance ratings that actually were in 5-6 years time. So there's a lot of that gets actually imposed or called for in a brief, and they revolve around lots of things, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but daylight views, indoor environmental quality, water conservation, and so on. So you tend to get a very strong brief, or that's what we see in Australia, that there is actually sustainability comes to the fore. It invariably is an integrated thing, so it effectively touches on virtually all aspects of things, and even particularly the operational side, because they actually have to maintain those performances for the life of the contract as well.
Okay, Yvon, I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, we see a lot of requirements, and one example is the LEED Gold building for the standards of design and construction, and then some utilities consumption bonuses and penalty schemes included in the contract, where compared to a baseline, how do we perform? And the good thing of using the private sector is we're prepared to take a risk, and we've done that in one instance where the LEED Gold was required, and from our experience, targeting LEED Platinum makes it actually cheaper on a life cycle basis. And you pointed that earlier. With PPP now, we're moving from a short-term sort of cost assessment to a life cycle cost assessment, and that's when all the long-term cost impact allows for a more sustainable solution.
Okay, I'm just going to take a question. We've got questions coming in from some of our audience, and this one, Jim, maybe this is perhaps more directed for you, but is another advantage to the private sector simply a reward for risk balance? Do you see it as that simple?
Yeah, well, yes, to some extent that's correct. If you look at in the early projects that we did here in Australia, where the major risks to the build project was the construction, and we're thinking in the first private prisons that we developed here, we built the prisons, and as soon as we built the prisons, there was a refi, and there was a significant refi gain to the private sector because of the risk, but government quickly jumped onto that and said that they wanted part of the share of the gains, but risk's all about risk and reward, and to some extent it is about trying to manage that risk throughout the construction, but also throughout the operations phase as well. And in its simplest form, yeah, I'd agree. It probably is. It is more about managing the risk and actually reaping the gains from managing that risk effectively.
I just want to pick up on
Richard,
sorry, go on. Carry on.
There are two sides to risk, aren't there, Jim? And yeah. I've seen many of the other side of the risk. The private sector take the risk, and then they don't manage it, and then they go bust, and they lose all their equity, and they lose a fair amount of debt. You think of Jarvis, you think of Lang, you think of Carillion in the UK. Who went bust mainly because of private sector PPPs, where they hadn't managed the risk. They signed up to performance output specifications they could not deliver, and they had to retrofit to get to the quality. So they didn't manage the risks. So there's two sides to it. And rather than the public sector losing that money, they actually, the private sector lost a shirt. So there are two sides to it, which is what your business, Jim, isn't it? Is
correct, exactly right. Teams. Yep. And I think you're right, Jonathan, in the sense that, and I think in Australia, especially in a number of projects recently in Australia, where the tunnel projects, where they have gone a bit awry. Government has now, I think, changed its tune a bit, understanding that potentially the passing risk back to the private sector may not be fully appropriate. I think, as Catherine mentioned as well, and so I think that also needs to be clearly thought out in terms of what risk can the private sector manage within its scope of work, and where it can't manage it, but takes it on. And as you said, Jonathan, they fall over.
Yeah. Jim, I just wanted to pick up on, it's a term you used that maybe some of our audience aren't familiar with. You use the term refi, or essentially refinancing. Yep. Can you maybe briefly explain for the audience what that means, how it comes about?
Well, typically in a PPP build project, we will get debt financing up until the end of construction, because largely that's one of the riskiest elements in terms of the delivery of the project, and at that point we end up having to refinance that debt, and because of that risk in terms of the debt financing has actually now been removed in terms of the construction, the actual cost of money becomes a lot less because of that lower risk level as well. And so there are those gains that potentially that when you refinance at a lower rate compared to what you were previously, and you're still getting paid the same amount of money from government, there is that gain side. Catherine will probably be more aware of on the legal side as to how governments have actually tried to actually reap some of those benefits.
Yeah, definitely. You made me smile as well, because we had in the UK we had exactly the same issue to do with prisons. So it was Fazakerley prison that was the very first one to be refinanced. And I know when we were doing financial close on Dartford Hospital in 1997, Fazakerley had just refinanced and no gain sharing. And I know we were the first project to put the gain wording into the contract to quickly close that gap, but it is exactly as Jim has described, and I think that key aspect is particularly for availability based projects where the availability payment is fixed, subject to indexation for the entirety of the project, and you refinance it at lower terms or lower financial terms, and there is a gain that's there, and then how do you share that gain? I'm still interested to this day as to how that the wording that we've developed in the UK, how that actually manifests itself, but everyone seems to get their way through it, but it is an interesting way of how you determine what that gain might be and how you share it with the public sector.
Right. I'll just take 2 seconds. Some other people have asked some questions and I'm not ignoring them. It's just, I've got a couple of questions that come up a little bit later on that may address them. If they don't, I'll come back to you, so don't panic. Catherine, while you're chatting there, I just thought, because you've been involved in a wide variety of PPP and across quite a number of different countries, do you think it's fair to say, or would you agree that the PPP procurement model generates economic stimulus?
Yeah, I do. And I think, at a very, very high level, and in fact, there's an acknowledged association between infrastructure and GDP growth. So in some studies that have happened, it states that a 1% growth in infrastructure stock is associated with a 1% growth in per capita GDP. So there is, at a higher macro level, absolutely. I think, and actually I think Yvon answered quite a lot of this as well when he talked about what PPP brings and the opportunities that it brings. But certainly in the early 90s, and I know when Norman Lamont put it in his autumn statement in 1992, one of the things that was in the back of his mind was the stimulus of the construction industry in the early 90s. And on the basis that that would bring jobs, it would bring skills, more contracts being signed, profits being made. And I know to some, and I've almost got Mayor Redken ringing in my head again, is that would seem to be a bad thing, but it isn't. And it certainly isn't for a stable economy. In Kuwait, when they were launching their program, a large motivator was about skill transfer and providing Kuwaitis with skills that could be learnt at home. So they stayed at home in Kuwait rather than leaving and training elsewhere. And that, you know, there are direct and indirect benefits of PPP. But, you know, there's the direct project, the benefit of the project itself. It will bring will work to the local area. It's very common in many jurisdictions to insist that local workforce is used. I know in the UK, the planning process insists on that. And in this region, it has its own name of Ization. So you've got Emiratisation, Omanisation, Saudiization. So just the project itself, in some cases, the asset itself will generate income. So an airport or a port, there's work and there's income coming from that. There's upskilling of a job. So that's to name a few. I'm not an economist by trade, and if I was, maybe I could list some more. But for sure, it leads to an increase in economic benefits for sure.
Interesting perspective. I'll throw something in just for the minute. It kind of deals with some of the previous questions we've asked, but one of the audience, Nicholas Davis, observes that an obvious advantage to PPP to the Middle East is improving the maintenance generally of the building stock, which is better buildings, better sustainability, and hopefully better relationships. I don't think any of us would necessarily disagree with that.
Just on that, I mean, we've done 3 universities in Abu Dhabi back in 2007, 8, 9, 10, in terms of through a sort of PPP type model, Zayed, Sorbonne, and New York. And we're still involved actually in terms of the operational oversight of those for the funders. And you're right, it's better performance, it's better maintained, and they're still looking extremely good quality facilities over there. I would say that, though, wouldn't I?
So this is a round table one. I just thought I would ask each one of you what the 2 main lessons you have learned from your experience of PPP. They can be good, they can be bad. I think, Cayman, let's start with you.
Okay. For me, better outcomes are, I suppose, delivered by a good brief. So the outcomes will be better if you get the brief right. I also think, having been involved in the only PPP that was unsuccessful is, I suppose, a PPP project is not a design and build project, and they should not be confused. So it is something that people need to be aware of. They're very different beasts, and they actually produce, in my mind, better outcomes than necessarily a design and build can, because of that operational focus that's there, but also adherence to the technical brief.
Okay. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Pretty much along the same lines as Cayman, but also I think Catherine raised the issue of profit before, and governments tend to want to I think that the private sector, and I keep saying this to our guys here, that the private sector think that, or the public sector think that the private sector is a philanthropic society, where where we can solve all their problems at no cost, and a lot of that needs to occur. Profit the government needs to leave money on the table for the private sector to actually build it, but also to operate it. And I've been on projects where they've taken that money off the table, and it's been a long 25 years in delivery, as Yvon will probably attest to. When you don't have the money to deliver at the quality standards you need to, it becomes a battle throughout the entire process. So I think from most of our projects that hasn't occurred, but in a couple it has, and that's created tension throughout that that process. So there needs to be an understanding from government, which I think they have finally got to, in terms of making sure the private sector does make some cash along the way so it can deliver on its promises.
Okay, Yvon, anything you want to add? You're on mute.
It had to happen, didn't it?
Yeah. You're on mute, Yvon. Oh,
nope.
Or maybe you've lost your microphone or your audio.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. You can now. Yeah.
Was I on mute? It doesn't show.
You were. Yeah.
No, you were. It just
it's hard to be. I agree with pretty much everything, and trying to be creative. Now I think we've covered job creation, upskills, a strong involvement with governments and with their objectives, their policies, the decision making, which are different in PPPs versus traditional procurement. I think it brings the private and the public sector closer together. When we create a 25-year partnership versus a 2-year partnership, for example. And that's been, sometimes it creates friction, but on the long run, I think it's a very good thing.
And Catherine, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I might hammer home this point about, I think the bad things I've seen are poorly prepared projects. So it is about the brief, but they really are a waste of time and money for everyone. So they're bad for the public sector as well, because it decreases their ability to use a proper competitive process to gain a project which has value for money. It affects their credibility, and it affects the attractiveness of the jurisdiction. If it all goes horribly wrong, people are going to say, well, I'm not really going to invest in there. There's many other places I can look. And, for the private sector, they really will lose money and time if it's all poorly prepared and it collapses. And I'm sure in some people's minds they're thinking, well, the only winners in this are the advisors. And I can truly say we don't like winning that way. It's incredibly frustrating. But I will add a good, because the delivery of infrastructure is where, but for PPP, in many cases, you just would not get that new hospital, water, power. So there is much needed infrastructure, and sometimes it just would never happen without a PPP.
Yeah, and I think, from my experience, I would probably just add, and it's touched on, I think Cayman mentioned it about the brief, and the brief being sufficiently thought through, from the fundamental of why you want to do the project you're doing from the public sector side, but also not going too far with the public sector solution to the brief. I mean, I've certainly experienced, receiving RFPs from the public sector that are overly detailed and stifle innovation, and it can create so a little bit of adversity at the beginning of the projects, when really the private sector's objective is to innovate as much as possible, to build something that's as efficient as possible. So you can challenge absolutely every aspect of the brief in collaboration with the public sector to arrive at the best outcome. And I've been fortunate to be involved in jobs that have been very successful because of that, where that engagement, as Yvonne's touched on, that relationship that you build at the beginning is a very important relationship. And the other thing, I guess, is around the risk transfer. I was involved in one PFI scheme where the contract and essentially the payment mechanism was to transfer all of the risk of energy to the private sector. So that's not just the risk of consumption, the amount of energy being used, but also the cost of energy. And of course, the private sector have absolutely no control over what the utility companies charge for energy. So how do you value that risk over 25, or as Yvon mentions, schemes that might run up to 50 years? And the same with the consumption of energy. In a lot of PPP schemes, the facilities are ultimately used by the public sector. And how does the private sector control the public sector's use of the facility? So some things you can control, some you can't. So, and again, it's just balancing those risks and making sure that we avoid those. So they'd probably be my two lessons. But the outcomes generally, if it's all well thought through, are really positive. I think I'll just pick up for the minute. This is probably coming in towards the last question, and it's a very broad and open question, so I'm probably going to end up putting people on the spot. And one of the audience has asked essentially the same question. My question was going to be, is the Middle East ready for PPP? And one of the audience questioned, are PPPs the way forward for the Middle East transport sector, which we can maybe deal with slightly separately. And one member of the audience asked, is PPP understood, and will it make a difference to the design and construction process? So I guess starting with the broader one, is the Middle East ready for PPP? Yvon, do you want to have a go at this one? Then
sure,
other people chip in.
Yes. So is the Middle East ready? The Middle East has been doing PPPs for quite a long time. One of the PPP segments is power plants, under 25-year contracts, and we have been doing that since 1998, and the region has been very successful in implementing those. And some other PPPs, RTA, the metro in Dubai, the tram in Dubai is a PPP. So in some sectors, it has been done very successfully. So we could say that the region is ready. I think the challenge we've seen is that the lessons learned from the power sector or some areas in the transportation sector haven't been fully transferred to, say, healthcare or education. But I think the foundations are there, and our friends in healthcare are learning from their colleagues in power and transport. I think they need to disseminate this experience in terms of getting the strong support from consultants, for example, getting market sounding from banks and investment community to make sure PPPs are bankable. A mentality switch from certain participants and embrace long-term commitments. We've seen in the region that there was still, to an extent, reluctance to enter into very long contracts. But I think those are already sort of being overcome, those challenges, and we think the region is ready for it.
What are your thoughts, Catherine, being involved across the region?
Yeah, I think, from a legal perspective, one of the things isn't always necessary, but is a good sign is whether or not there's a PPP law. So from a legal and regulatory framework. So Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Oman, Qatar and Kuwait all have PPP laws and legislation is being developed. I say Saudi and Bahrain, but in relation to Saudi, I had a report this morning from a Twitter in Arabic, so I hope I'm correct, that the PPP law has been approved by the cabinet in Saudi as of this morning. So we've all seen it in draft before now. But notwithstanding that, even though you don't necessarily need a PPP law, and both Saudi and Bahrain have both delivered successful projects. But I agree with Yvon, there has been a lot of PPPs in the power sector, and I think what will be coming to the fore and is starting to come to the fore is social infrastructure and economic infrastructure, so like transport. But in order to be fully ready, and there's a number of things that we've talked about today, you do need a proper pipeline. You do need well-prepared projects before they're launched. You do need a framework to support that balanced risk apportionment so that those projects are, I say, investable, because it's both bankable and, picking up Jim's point, attracting equity, and you need that momentum to keep going to attract the private sector into a market. So I agree with Yvon. I think it is ready and can be delivered. There's a lot there, and there's a lot of appetite, and there's a lot that can be done, and it isn't all about, you know, raising finance and not having the finance. There's more to it that comes from doing a PPP in this region.
Okay. Also, I think to that extent, Catherine, there's the, you know, in the past where you have power project, transport projects, which are fairly straight up and down, understanding what needs to be done to procure those assets, whereas a social infrastructure project such as health, for example, I know, having worked in the Middle East on a health project, you know, in the past, I don't know whether or not it's still the same. They went to whether France or Germany and said, build me a hospital, and then basically went to either the UK or Canada and said, operate the hospital for me. So whereas a PPP in itself is an amalgam of the private sector, the contractor, the FM operator, and the health operator to actually build a facility that actually meets the requirements of a particular brief. And whether or not the Middle East has got that capability of actually providing all those elements together, as well as having a contractor that can actually accept the construction risks and the PPP risks, I'll leave that up to you.
I think Scott, oh, sorry, Jonathan. Just what's quite interesting in relation to that, and I think that's one of the other lessons of bringing something into a region, is localizing it or regionalizing it. So there's an acknowledged risk allocation world over on a certain number of topics, and I completely agree with you, Jim, in relation to the healthcare. Because of the beginning of the healthcare market here in the Middle East, you have to adopt a different approach to the delivery of healthcare services, because the skills are not necessarily there, because they've done exactly as you've said, built as a hospital and then found somebody else to operate it. And so there isn't that inherent, like we have in the UK with the National Health Service or some form of public delivery of healthcare. So there needs to be an adaptation of that system to make, and I know, for example, both Oman and Saudi were looking at whether or not they would add clinical services into a healthcare PPP, and I think actually it has been done in Australia, interestingly, and using that example, I was going to say Northern Beaches, but I don't think it's Northern Beaches Hospital.
No, it is. In Northern Beaches.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we did a privatisation of the Trade Regional Hospital and Mildura Base Hospital. Were all privatisations, both. So they were all private sector delivery of public hospital services.
Which is where this region can learn from Australia, for example, because not many other jurisdictions have rolled in clinical services into a health PPP. And sorry, Jonathan, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. Just one point, linking back, you mentioned, I think it was the pipeline of projects, and that just picks up on the need for a market to be created, the creation of the market we haven't touched on. And the confidence that the private sector need to have in that marketplace, and then how that procurement will progress. There's a pipeline so they can invest, but then the actual procurement. Are we going to ask 12 bidders to bid all the way through, 6 bidders to bid all the way through? Or are we going to actually understand the level of investment and time that both the public sector and the private sector need to undertake during these procurements, and get the right number of bidders who understand what they're going to do, are invested, and will see it through? And therefore you end up with probably 3 bidders doing the detailed bid. That is a really key thing. That I know there's often this drive for more people will get a better solution. It won't be a better solution. So it's actually understanding those dynamics as well when you take it to the procurement process into delivering these projects.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting point, Jonathan. I'm not sure how many people, you know, that don't understand PPP understand the actual cost for the private sector in bidding for a PPP. You know, the deliverables that they have to submit in order to ultimately secure the project, you know, to reach financial close. Up until a certain point in that bidding process, all of the bidders are at risk, and only one party actually secures the project at the end of the day. I don't know, Jim, if you want to add anything to that, because you're generally, I suspect, on the receiving end of a lot of this cost.
Correct. And I think, Richard, to that extent, health in Victoria over recent times never paid a stipend, but I think in our most recent project where we reached financial close, we insisted that if we didn't win, we'd get a stipend. And I think, you know, as you say, the costs of bidding a $1.5 billion hospital project is probably around about $8 to $10 million Australian. In terms of a $15 billion road project is probably around about $10 to $15 million worth of bidding costs, and you only recoup only a fraction of that. But you're right, they are significant costs, and the costs are largely driven by what the government sector wants you to actually submit and the level of detail that it wants you to submit. And that's where most of the money is in terms of developing all those requirements for government, and it takes time and money to do all of that, and also a number of consultants that need to be engaged to actually to deliver on all of that.
Yeah, and I think that probably. Sorry, Karen.
I was going to say, from a consultant's perspective, we also share that risk, because basically we'll get some financial return for the efforts for the bid phase, but it doesn't cover the cost. So you're taking a risk yourself. So there's a time and effort that's there. And I suppose there's a temptation with some of the briefs to just keep adding more and more layers of stuff to do. But earlier in the piece, so they're probably absolutely justifiable to do, but should they be done at the bid phase? Should be done to the extent they're asked to do? It just adds extra layers and extra risk factors in there to try and maintain the quality of what you're trying to deliver, because they take a lot of time.
Yeah, and I think that probably links back to Catherine and Jonathan's point around pipeline. You know, bidders, the process, I think, you know, I've certainly begun to see it already in the market here, where we've got lots of bidders bidding for some of the social infrastructure projects that are coming out. And, you know, a year or 2 years down the line, maybe sooner than that, bidders will regulate what they bid for based on their perceived risk of that project and their understanding of the project. And, you know, that because you can't win every project, so you have to balance that risk out, don't you? I've got a few more. Sorry, Yvon.
As developers, it's finding the right balance between managing a pipeline and managing a bidding budget. It's the essence of what we're doing. So having the government understand that and support in terms of clarity of the expectations is quite essential.
Yeah. I've had a couple of questions in, which I think I'll try and ask. We've covered some of them, but there's a couple of interesting ones. Readiness for PPP in the Middle East might not be the same for all countries. Which ones are less prepared or are appealing for private sector and financing institutions? I'll leave it to any of you to answer that question. I certainly won't be answering.
Yeah.
There's plenty of elements to this question. Some of the countries have been early adopters of PPPs and therefore have a tried and tested model for procurement and interactions with private sector, but some of them have had financial difficulties. So we're very keen to engage with people at the operational level. However, for the funding, it has become a challenge. In other areas, richer countries, are just starting. So it's not a black or white question. It's in the middle. Depends on the sector. Depends on who's involved. Depends on how we can structure financing. I don't know.
I mean, from my perspective, although I suppose I've probably the least connectability to the Middle East, I do think it's about, I suppose, recognizing that the PPP process can and has been successful in different parts of the world. So you need to bring that expertise to the table from a technical advisor, from a brief writing perspective, and from an evaluation and engagement perspective. And also from basically the government evaluation perspective. I think it's one of the strengths here in Australia is that most states, not all states, political interference can be kept at bay. Once the PPP process starts, it stays that way. And it allows that actual knowledge to grow and actually enhance the process for everybody, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I should say in terms of something like the Middle East, it probably very much like Canada was almost 20 years ago when I went across to Canada and had one of their first PPP projects. And they basically took the UK requirements and we basically superimposed the Australian aspects to that, which were a bit more streamlined in terms of the FM specs and in terms of some of the contracts, and that became the Canadian system and has worked well for them over the last 20 years in terms of how they've developed those. And I think the Middle East will be in the same boat in terms of being able to take what's available out there in the market, whether it's the UK, Australia, or Canada or whatever, and actually build upon those sorts of aspects which work for them. I think, as Catherine said, depending on how you actually procure those projects and what works for each of those regions will be developed over time and with each of those governments.
Yeah, I think you touched on it earlier, Catherine, didn't you? That there's different drivers for PPP. You know, it's not all about money. It's there are other aspects to it, and that's probably what varies from country to country.
Yeah, and I think it's not a surprise in the UK. They started with hospitals and prisons because they were all aging, crumbling Victorian buildings that had a backlog maintenance in them that was bigger than a new build. But the work we did in Cyprus for the Cyprus government, the first project that achieved financial close was 2 new airports. But that was important for Cyprus because Cyprus was their biggest revenue came from tourists and needed to get the tourists into the country in a vaguely nice environment once landing, because that became, you know, the shop window for having a 2-week holiday in Cyprus. In other jurisdictions, it's about utilities and power and water. So the motivations for a country is massive, and certainly when looking at whether or not you invest in that country and what you can bring to the party, I think is quite important as well.
Yeah, Okay, that's good. So the last question I haven't addressed, and I won't say I've saved the best till last, but this is a nice one, tricky one. It's kind of UAE focused, but I guess you could consider it across the wider region. It's really around the potential fragility of private sector companies, the market that we operate in potentially, and concern around the potential changes in investment regulations, and how that could impact on, a procurement mechanism that has quite a long life to it. I don't know, maybe this is something to discuss on a future webinar, because it sounds to me like we could be straying into some very murky waters around this one. But I guess it's an interesting discussion to have. I don't know if anybody, Catherine or Jim or anybody else, has had any experiences with this so far.
Yeah, I think Catherine's probably better apt, but from mine, I think it's all about sovereign risk, and to what extent does the private sector, as well as the lenders, see and perceive what is the sovereign risk of what you've just said, Richard, in terms of it is a long-term project, and to what extent those risks are that potentially can't be managed throughout a 25-year or 30-year term.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, the part of the procurement process should pick up the financial evaluation and the strength of the financial standing of the businesses that are tendering. And that needs to be quite robust, especially if you've got a fragile private sector marketplace, private sector companies. Are they able to take on these contracts and have the capacity in their balance sheets,
Correct,
and the liquidity of the businesses, etc., to take on these levels of risks? That's all part of the market shaping that we touched on earlier. People need to understand it, and there need to be parameters and thresholds that have to be achieved to go through to the next stage of the competition. So you end up with a robust 3 players, 4 players to do the detailed work at the end. And you don't want these issues coming out at that stage. Hence, the way you procure is really, really quite important.
Yeah, and I think at the origin of the issue, I think very common for not just the UAE and for the region is foreign direct investment, and how that gets played into the marketplace. So I agree with both of you. It's how that shapes that, and there have been changes and a little flip-flopping going on in the UAE as to bringing that for FDI into projects. And I know we're waiting this month because you had to have a 49% to set up a company onshore. You needed a 49% partner, local UAE partner for these projects. Then there was an FDI law, and then actually there was a slight change to that, but we don't know what the change to that is yet, and I think it's due out this month actually. But I think that all goes to your point, Jonathan, about how do you create the optimal environment in which these projects are given enough of a platform and enough of a comfort to be able to thrive, so it's easy for those elements to be done so that the projects can be delivered. And I think that the back end of that question is what can we all do? And I think Yvon mentioned the market sounding exercise. That is a really early opportunity for the private sector to make their thoughts known about the obstacles or barriers that there might be to a process, so that those can be factored in before a project's launched, and then that goes to project preparation and everything else that's there. So it was a good question.
Right. Well, I think we've reached the end of our session. I think I've certainly found it thoroughly enjoyable, and hopefully our audience did as well. There's a lot of questions around PPP and a lot more to discuss. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are planning on running another 3 webinars dealing with some of the more specifics around the procurement process and the delivery and operations processes and some of the things that come out of that. But I'd just like to personally thank all of you, our wonderful panelists, for sharing your knowledge. And I'll hand back over to Olga.
Yes, thanks a lot. That was a very interesting discussion, and thanks to our audience for questions. Rana in particular asked if we will be sharing a recording. So yes, we will be sharing the recording of this webinar with all attendees, and also we will be sharing this on social media. So we hope to share this knowledge and all the lessons learned that we discussed today with the wider audience. And if anyone from our attendees today have any other questions, follow-up discussions, or maybe want to participate in future panel discussions, just get in touch with us. We will be here. We will be happy to hear from you. So thank you for our panel. It was very interesting. Thanks a lot for your time. In morning, evening, and almost afternoon in Dubai. And we hope to continue this conversation and have you involved in our future webinars too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I should say happy St. Patrick's Day, just to get it right. So, and thank you, Catherine, for wearing the green.
Yes.
So.
I should have said that at the beginning, shouldn't I? Given that I was brought up in Ireland. We chose the background to resemble a famous Irish drink, you know. Okay, well, take care, everybody, and thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.